Hi, this is Troy Hunt, and I'd like to talk to you about ransomware. This is a particularly malicious strain of malware that's become enormously prevalent and is proving to be especially damaging to organizations and individuals alike. In this course, I'd like to talk to you about what those impacts are. So what does it mean when machines are infected with malware? How does it get into those machines in the first place? So what are the delivery channels? And then what does it do once it's in there? What are the mechanics of ransomware? We'll also talk about paying the ransom. Does it actually make sense? Should you ever pay? And then we'll move on and we'll talk about how ransomware is evolving, because it's a class of malware which is changing very quickly and in some really worrying ways as well. And then finally, we're going to talk about defensive measures. So how can you recover if you are infected by malware? Or even better, how can you prevent your systems from being infected in the first place? So that's what we're going to cover. Let's jump into it and start talking about ransomware. Very quickly about me before we get into the details of this class of attack. I am Troy Hunt. I spend a lot of my time training technology professionals about how to better secure their systems. You'll often find me speaking at events around the world and running workshops for organizations trying to stay ahead of today's online risks. You can find me on Twitter @TroyHunt or on my blog at troyhunt.com. So that's it for me. Let's jump into it and start looking at what it means to get hit with ransomware. On the 5th of Feb in 2016, the Hollywood Presbyterian Medical Center made an alarming discovery. They'd been infected with malware. Their files were encrypted with AES encryption in such a way that the hospital simply couldn't read them. Now think about what it means for a hospital to be infected with malware that makes it impossible for them to read files. So for example, they had to divert emergency patients because they didn't have the ability to process them. It also impacted their ability to run their normal day-to-day patient care programs. And then think about all the impact it would have had on the back office. So everything that happens behind the scenes of a hospital in order to keep it ticking along. Seeing a hospital infected with ransomware makes you understand just how vicious this class of malware really is. Here's an organization designed to help people stay healthy, in some cases stay alive, and their ability to do that was severely impacted when they got hit. They had to revert to pen and paper in place of automated systems. So think about what it means for an organization like a hospital to have to revert to the practices of a couple of decades ago just to look after their patients. In the case of the Hollywood Presbyterian, the ransomware was demanding payment of 40 bitcoins. Now to put that in today's money, that's about $17,000. And that probably sounds like a lot of money. It is a lot of money. $17,000 just to undo the impact of one piece of software. But then again, you think about a hospital and you think about that $17,000 and it makes you wonder, what is their data actually worth? $17,000 for an entire hospital doesn't actually seem like so much. And then you ask the question, what are their services worth? Because it's not just a question of the data itself, but whilst this incident was taking place, there were all sorts of services that they couldn't provide. In many cases, commercial services they couldn't provide. And when you actually start to think about that $17,000 in context, the alarming thing is it's actually a bargain. And this is what makes ransomware so effective. It makes good economic sense to pay it. And that's just what they ultimately did. They paid the ransomware. So after the 10 days, after paying that ransom, they restored their services and they moved on. I want to go and talk about the impact on those who are infected with ransomware. And we're going to look at those numbers a little bit more closely and also talk about what it means at the individual level when ransomware hits. Obviously, ransomware involves holding digital assets hostage until a ransom is paid. And most frequently these days, that means seeing ransomware that will actually encrypt files such that they're entirely illegible but easily unlocked with a decryption key. What I'd like to do now though is have a look at what it actually means to those who are hit by ransomware. And I want to go back to that Hollywood Presbyterian Medical Center for a moment. Let me show you something. This is their schedule of costs. It dates back to 2012, so assumably by the time they were hit with the ransomware, it could well be somewhat higher. But this gives us a good indication of the sorts of money a hospital of that scale is dealing with. Now, in particular, I'd like to draw out one figure in here, and it's this one. CT scans. Their charges for CT scans in 2012 were $41.5 million. That's $113,000 a day. They just paid a $17,000 ransom. And if they were running that CT scan service 24/7, that's only a few hours of actually running the service. So when you put that in perspective and you ask that question again, is $17,000 good value? Well, yes, it's enormously good value, particularly when you consider it took them 10 days to pay this. That's over $1 million worth of revenue from their CT scan service. Particularly for organisations where they have large revenues, the ROI of paying ransoms is extremely good, and that is a very alarming fact, because the last thing any of us want to think about is actually paying the criminals who've locked our files. Now, obviously, when we look at organisations like this, they're big numbers. They make headlines. But what's not always quite as clear is the impact on individuals, because ransomware is usually indiscriminate. It doesn't care if you're a hospital or a bank or a sole trader. Let me give you an example of that. These are the instructions to unlock a machine that's been infected with CryptoLocker. As you can see, they've been printed out and they've been annotated. They've been annotated by my mother-in-law. She got CryptoLocker on her machine via a malicious email. It did exactly what effective ransomware does, which is it encrypted all the files and it made them illegible. Now for her, that made things very difficult because she runs a small business. She needs access to things like documents and spreadsheets in order to actually earn income. This is by no means a multi-million-dollar business like the Hollywood Presbyterian we saw just before, but for her, this was enormously damaging. And it wasn't just damaging in terms of the loss of revenue and the time and the effort it took to deal with it, but have a read of the comments she's written here. Have a think of the state of mind that left her in when she found that someone had deliberately made her files inaccessible. She's irate. She was in a panic. She was very upset about it. And she is just one of millions and millions of people that are being infected with ransomware. Fortunately, in her case, we were able to recover without paying the ransom. We had a good backup strategy running and we restored from there. And certainly that's something I'll talk about later on in the course when we get into defensive measures. But so many other people don't have that choice. And demands like what you see here are very carefully orchestrated to convince that person to pay. There's a certain amount of social engineering going on here. They're creating fear and urgency and trying to prompt the victim into action. And again, think about the scale of this. In fact, we've got a pretty good idea of the scale. Let me show you. This is a quote by Kevin Beaumont, who's done a lot of great work on analysing malware, particularly around the Locky variant in early 2016. This is a stunning figure. 4,000 infections an hour, 100,000 infections a day, 1 million every week and a half. Do the maths for a moment. You don't need many people to pay very much money at all, and this becomes an enormously lucrative business. So when you consider that, you can see why ransomware is becoming so popular. We just talked about it being a good ROI on the victim to pay for it, and we can see here that it is spreading like wildfire. Is it any wonder that ransomware is becoming so popular with criminals? Part of what makes this infection rate so high is the way that it's distributed in such an indiscriminate fashion. And because it is distributed so indiscriminately, we see all sorts of different organisations being impacted by it. Let me show you what I mean. This is just a small selection of headlines which give you a bit of a sense of how many different classes of organisations are hit with ransomware. So think about schools, for example. They tend to have a huge number of machines, not just for administrative purposes, but for students as well. That's a pretty large attack surface. In the case of the school, and this particular one was in South Carolina, they agreed to pay $8,500. Churches. This one was the Community Christ Church in Hillsboro, Oregon. They got hit. They almost certainly don't have the deep pockets of someone like the Hollywood Presbyterian, but the effort of delivering it to the church was probably just the same as the effort of delivering it to the hospital. We'll talk about that in a moment when we get on to the delivery channels. Even the police are fair game. This case was Swansea in Massachusetts, and they paid. The police paid the crooks just to unlock their machines. When even the cops are paying the bad guys, you know we've got a serious problem on our hands. But they're paying for the same reasons as the school and the same reasons as the hospital, because it's a good ROI to pay. Well-written ransomware is so effective that you're unlikely to simply be able to revert your files without paying. And whether you're a small community church or a multi-million-dollar hospital, you're still a target, and you're still going to have a very difficult time if you get hit by ransomware. So much so that we're seeing so many of these organisations actually pay the criminals. So that's a little bit more background on the impact of this class of malware. Let's go and talk about how it actually gets onto these machines in the first place. Let's talk about ransomware delivery channels. In some ways, ransomware is nothing new. We've had malware for decades. And over that time, we've seen various different delivery mechanisms used to infect victims. If you go back far enough, it was actually discs sent in the mail. We'll take a look at an example of that later on. But these days, there's a few other primary channels that are used by criminals in order to infect target machines. Let's go and take a look at some of those. This was the state of the EC Council's website in March 2016. And it was particularly unfortunate for these guys because they do specialise in security certifications, yet their website was compromised in a way that ultimately led to the delivery of ransomware. The problem here is that the website was serving up the Angler exploit kit. But what made it particularly hard to detect is that it would only be served up under certain circumstances. So the embed script you see here in the source code would only be present if the visitor had Microsoft's Internet Explorer, or at least the user agent had to suggest it was IE. The visitor also had to come from a search engine like Google or Bing, and the script that decided whether or not to embed that exploit kit would also check the visitor's IP address to ensure it wasn't blacklisted or belonged to a blocked geolocation. Now, in part, this was inevitably to try and make it more difficult to actually detect the infected site. There's also speculation that it may have been done to try and avoid visitors from countries where there was a bad ROI on the malware. So, for example, victims from an emerging market with a very low price tolerance are not going to have the same ROI as if the ransomware could infect victims from, say, Western Europe or even Australia. EC Council ultimately tracked down this flaw and they attributed it to a vulnerability in a third-party plugin. On further analysis, they found that that Angler exploit kit was then configured to drop the Tesla crypt ransomware on the victim's machine. Now, that Angler exploit kit has been very good at exploiting weaknesses in plugins like Silverlight and Flash. And what this means is that this was a drive-by infection. Drive-by insofar as you simply open the website, you've got a vulnerable plugin that Angler exploits to then deliver the ransomware and execute it on your machine. But it is drive-by, and that's what's so worrying, because you're simply visiting a website. You're not opening malicious files, you're not falling for phishing attacks, you've simply gone to a website. A security website at that. The only thing that you've possibly done wrong in order to be infected this way is to have a vulnerable plugin on the machine. Let me give you an example. Over the years, we have seen a lot of Adobe security advisories. And unfortunately, there have been a lot of ongoing vulnerabilities in Flash. But not just Flash, we've seen similar things with Silverlight and similar things with Java as well. In fact, it's because of these sorts of vulnerabilities that Chrome started blocking Flash ads in late 2015. The real risk here, and you can see this in the details of the advisory, is giving that attacker the ability to take over an affected machine, being able to run arbitrary code on someone simply loading a page in a website. In the case we just saw, it was EC Council's website that was compromised. But the problem today is that you don't even need to directly visit an infected website, because there are many websites that are very solid. They have no known security vulnerabilities, yet they have another weakness. Let me show you what that is. The weakness is they embed ads. And we've seen ad networks compromised time and time again such that they serve malicious software. The stories you're seeing here date from March 2016. And when you think about it, delivering malicious software via an ad network actually makes a lot of sense, and it makes a lot of sense for a few reasons. Number one is that there's a very broad reach. Ad networks often span thousands, tens of thousands of different sites of all different natures, and getting malicious ads into that one network gives the attacker access to a huge range of victims. The other thing that makes it work well is the nature of the way ads are delivered on the web. They don't just get served up from the ad network as a simple image that loads on a web page. Instead, they load up their own documents. When you see that small ad on a page, it's actually loading up HTML, JavaScript, potentially plugins, and all sorts of other things which give the attacker the ability to exploit weaknesses in the browser. We've seen so many cases like this over the years, and it's no wonder that people are increasingly being driven towards using ad blockers, because not only do they not want to see the ads or incur the latency overheads of loading that content, but they don't want to get infected by malware, and that's very understandable. But that creates yet another problem, because now advertisers have trouble monetizing their services. Because of that, we see things like this. Media sites are now requesting people using ad blockers to disable them. It's not just Forbes, there are others that do the same thing. And what they're doing is actually driving users who've decided to take a defensive position on ads to revert that decision and expose themselves to potential risks. The thing is though, this actually works. Forbes found that 50% of people that saw this message did actually disable their ad blocker and would load the ads just so that they could read the content. However, in doing that, it does create another problem, and it's this. We come full circle. We're back to the problem that malware can be served up through ads, and unfortunately, that is what happened in this case. Both these delivery channels, compromised website and malicious ads, are particularly effective because they are drive-by. Load the website in the browser, malicious software exploits a vulnerability and delivers a payload. However, there's another way of distributing ransomware, and it's exactly what happened to my mother-in-law. Email. We all get huge volumes of spam. It's an inevitability of being on the web today. And often that spam does include malicious software. I just went to my mail, opened one of the first ones I saw, and it was this one just here. Now there's a little bit of social engineering going on here as well. Latest price list is attached. That sounds interesting. Maybe somebody might open that out of curiosity. Out of curiosity, I took the attachment and uploaded it to VirusTotal, after which it came back and gave me a pretty affirmative response that this was malicious content. Now fortunately, Outlook has also blocked this on my behalf, but as I just mentioned with my mother-in-law's case, there are plenty of people that will receive these emails and open the attachments. So email as a delivery channel for ransomware, whether it be embedded directly in the email or linked through and the user simply ends up loading it from another website, email remains an enormously popular channel. So that's a few different ways that ransomware is infecting machines. But what does it do once it's in there? What are the mechanics of what happens when a machine is infected with ransomware? Let's take a look. Already in this course, I've mentioned several different variants of ransomware. And just as we have a huge array of malware in general as the broader category of malicious software, there are many different ransomware variants as well, and they do operate in different ways. Let's go and take a look at how one of the most malicious pieces of ransomware at the time of recording operates. In early 2016, we saw the emergence of the Locky ransomware variant, and Locky has proven to be particularly effective. in part because it is actually very good at encrypting files. It does exactly what encryption should do. It makes the file inaccessible unless you have the decryption key. When Locky infects a machine, one of the first things it does is loads itself into memory and deletes itself. So now it's gone from the file system, but it's still running there on the machine. It then goes to work, and one of the first things it does is drops down to your documents and starts encrypting those on the local disk. This is how we most often think of ransomware: trawling through the hard drive, finding files that match certain patterns, and most ransomware variants are looking for specific file types: documents, images, videos, files that will be of value to the user, so it warrants paying the ransom, but not files that are required to actually keep the operating system running. Because after all, the attacker does want the machine to keep working so that the victim can go through the process of ultimately paying the ransom. Now, Locky doesn't just encrypt the local disk, it also works its way through network storage, and it encrypts those files as well. Think of what this means in the enterprise. Network storage is where most companies' sensitive files are. They're sitting out there on file shares, accessible via desktop machines. That's inevitably how we interact with them. But by the same token, that's precisely how ransomware can interact with them. If it can find files on the network, and the identity that it's executing under has the rights to actually modify those files, then Locky works through and encrypts them. But it goes further than that. It also moves on to the VSS snapshots. So this is what we would normally use to roll back versions of files, and it deletes them. Obviously, it does this because it's trying to remove one of the avenues that the victim would have for recovery. That shadow copy service is there so that if a file is corrupted or lost or damaged in some other way, you can roll back to another version. But that's exactly what ransomware doesn't want you doing. So a product like Locky is smart enough to remove that avenue and force the victim towards actually paying the ransom. It goes further than that. It then goes and sets the desktop wallpaper to an image with instructions about demanding the ransom. We'll have a look at just what that looks like in just a moment. And finally, it also drops a text file on the file system, again with instructions about payment. That text file then appears next to encrypted files in the hope that the victim will open it up, follow the instructions, and pay the ransom. So what's interesting about what you see here is just how well thought out the software is. It's not just about encrypting files, it's about removing the avenues to recover from the attack and then helping the user, for want of a better term, by providing them instructions on payment. Here's what it looks like after Locky's been through a system. This would normally be your files. It'd be documents and spreadsheets and images. Instead, what we've got a whole bunch of hashes in place of file names and a .locky extension. You'll note here that the dates on all these are identical, but the file sizes are different. Inevitably, this particular machine had a whole bunch of different files of different sizes, and then Locky went through and encrypted them all in one go, hence the same date. The files are still there, the content is still there. It's just strongly encrypted. This is a pretty common pattern. Here's another one. This is Roku. It's a similar sort of deal, except in this case it's kept the original file name, added the .roku extension, and as you can see towards the bottom of that screen cap, provided instructions on how to unlock, which of course inevitably involves paying money. Let's take a look at the instructions that Locky provides. Here's a machine infected with Locky, and we can see here that they're referring to RSA and then go on to reference AES 128 ciphers. That won't mean much to most people that get infected with Locky, but it doesn't have to. It just has to sound intimidating enough that they don't feel they're left with many choices. But the problem is they're also right, because those of us that do understand how effective AES encryption is realize that retrieving any data without the decryption key is going to be exceptionally difficult. Of course, they go on to say that decryption is only possible with the private keys and the decryption program, which is on our secret server. We've then got a bunch of Tor hidden service links after that, or more specifically, clear web services that will route through to Tor. Your average user isn't going to be able to connect directly to Tor. So in order to improve the usability of the system and increase their chances of being paid the ransom, they're making it easy for people. They do go on to provide instructions on how to obtain Tor if you do want to connect directly to the Onion service. And finally, they provide your unique ID, and you can see that represented throughout this screenshot here. This is important because this machine does have a unique private key required in order to unlock its files. And all of this is managed centrally by command and control servers. The nature of the internet and the way ransomware is distributed means that you're going to get people from all over the world getting infected. So Locky actually localizes the instructions. They've gone to the effort of translating the whole thing into multiple different languages in order to increase their chances of being paid the ransom. Even the Wikipedia links to RSA and AES have been localized, in this case into Japanese. It's worth taking a moment to consider the parallels with normal commercial grade software, the focus on usability, the language localization. Ransomware today is not only increasingly sophisticated, it's increasingly usable. All of this brings us through to the point of actually paying the ransom. Let's go on and take a look at how that works. Nobody ever wants to pay a ransom. But as we've seen multiple times already throughout this course, that is often the case. The hospital paid the ransom, the school paid the ransom, even the police paid the ransom. So let's go through that process. Let's take a look at how criminals are facilitating the payment of the ransom. And I want to start by looking at a very particular variant of ransomware. This starts out by reading like so many other variants of ransomware do. But as you're reading through this, you may find that the language used is a little bit quaint, a little bit antiquated. You may also notice the reference to a self-installing diskette, which doesn't sound like particularly modern ransomware. And it's not. This is the AIDS Trojan. It dates all the way back to 1989. That's how long we've had ransomware for. Decades. It's just that today it's hugely more effective. Now, back in the late 80s, what this Trojan would do was encrypt the names of files on the C drive. And that, understandably, had a fundamental impact on the operation of the machine. Back in 89, though, there was no modern-day internet to distribute this class of malware with. Instead, they had to distribute it like this, in an envelope. They were phishing people via the postal service. They weren't taking Bitcoin either. They needed a banker's draft, a cashier's check, or international money order. So the mechanics of it was somewhat different from today. But the point is that ransomware itself is nothing new. It's been around for a very long time. We're simply seeing very effective, very modern incarnations of it now. Now compare this to one of today's variants. Criminals are making it so easy to pay ransoms that they even include a QR code. And of course, this is how we often pay with Bitcoin today. Point your phone at a QR code and simply pay money to someone else's Bitcoin address. This is a really low friction way of paying money. Any money for anything, but particularly for ransomware, because of course they also get the benefits of anonymity. For many victims, Bitcoin will be a very foreign concept. So what you find in many of these ransomware variants is very clear instructions about how to use a Bitcoin exchange to convert cold hard currency into cryptocurrency. So we're back to the usability aspect again. This very user-friendly way of making the software accessible. Clear instructions, nice QR code to pay your Bitcoins, and if they've set things up just right, very difficult to trace the payments. But let's talk about that for a moment. Let's delve into this issue of paying the ransom, because clearly people are doing it, but it just doesn't feel right. Here's what the Hollywood Presbyterian Medical Center had to say after they paid the ransom. This is an ROI. Quickest, most efficient. These are the sort of factors that go into making a financial decision. On the one hand, we could try and recover our systems through various approaches, and that's going to have particularly a time cost, possibly a dollar cost as well. On the other hand, we could pay that $17,000 and get our systems back up and running. And clearly they've gone with the latter. They've done the maths and said, yes, it makes sense to pay the criminals. For businesses in particular that get hit with ransomware, time is one of the critical factors that goes into them making a decision about whether they should pay or not. Criminals understand this. That's why they do things like this. This is the maktub ransomware variant, and maktub is an Arabic word for "it is written," which essentially means it was always going to happen anyway. So assumably they're implying that the victim was always going to get infected. But maktub is interesting for a couple of reasons. Number one is that it is very professionally designed. In fact, there's been quite a bit of commentary about just how slick it looks. Someone has actually put a lot of work into the aesthetics of this. But going back to the point about time, notice how they have different stages here, and depending on how long you take to pay, the amount you pay changes. They're effectively offering early bird specials. If you can pay in the first 3 days, it's only going to be half as much as if it takes you 9 days. Get in quick and save. They're using exactly the same techniques that so many other legitimate organizations use in order to create a sense of urgency. Consider this also in the social engineering context. Urgency is one of the drivers attackers use to force people into making decisions that they might not otherwise make if they take the time to carefully consider them. Time pressure is a very conscious strategy. But when you pay the ransom, what are you actually paying for? What do you actually get? Going back to Kevin Beaumont for a moment, you're paying for the decryptor, or at least a combination of the decryptor with a private key, but as he said here, it is akin to paying your hostage takers for freedom. Let's go and take a look at exactly how that works. And because payment is frequently facilitated via online services, we can go and have a look at one of those now. I'm here in the Tor browser on a .onion website looking at the payment screen for Locky. The first thing they want before doing anything else is your personal ID, or as you can see here, any .locky file name. And if you remember from the earlier screen grab, we could see that a Locky infected machine renamed every single file with a hash. So I'm going to enter one of those here, and we'll see what happens next. So here's the Locky payment screen. And the first thing you'll notice here is what I referred to earlier on in terms of giving people guidance about how to get access to Bitcoin. So you'll see here they've got a bunch of different recommendations. Here's where to get your Bitcoins from. This is guidance that even relatively non-tech savvy people could follow, and that's really the whole point. Maximize usability, because if they can make it easy, then they can increase their return from infected victims. We can see a little bit further down in step 4, they're asking for 1 Bitcoin to be sent to a very specific address. They suggest that payment could take half an hour or more, and that you should refresh the page, after which you'll be given access to the decryptor, which of course will contain the private key which is required to unlock the encrypted files. One of the things that should strike you when looking at this is just how normal it is. It's not at all dissimilar to a normal payment page for, say, a software product. The instructions are clear, the language and grammar is perfect, and it certainly doesn't feel malicious. It's easy to use. And this again is reflective of just how mainstream ransomware has become. It's almost as though it's grown up and it's become commercial grade software. Certainly, it is very big business. In fact, if we scroll up a little bit, you can see that, like those Locky messages we saw earlier, even the payment site localizes into various languages. Now there's just one more thing I want to show you before I go on and talk about the evolving face of ransomware. And that's this statement from the FBI. This was said during the 2015 Cybersecurity Summit. Even the FBI are suggesting that perhaps you should just be paying the ransom. And it's hard not to take their advice seriously, not just because they're the FBI, but because of everything else we've looked at so far in this course. Part of the problem, though, is that there are no guarantees. You don't get your money back if you pay the ransom and it doesn't work. There's definitely no consumer protection. You're just taking a gamble. So that's payment. Let's now move on and take a look at how ransomware is evolving. Just before we looked at the AIDS Trojan from 1999, and I mentioned that we really are talking about decades worth of ransomware evolution. And that's precisely what's happening. It's continuing to evolve. At the time of recording in 2016, we've seen the rates of ransomware increase dramatically. And we've also seen the sophistication of ransomware increase as well. Part of this is due to criminals always trying to make it more effective. And that's what I want to look at now. Let's start with this one. This is Cerber, and for the most part this looks like normal ransomware messaging. Your files have been encrypted, please connect to Tor and go to this address and pay the ransom. That's pretty par for the course for modern day ransomware. However, when you're infected with Cerber, it suddenly starts to do this.
Attention. 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 Your documents, photos, databases and other important files have been encrypted. Your documents, photos, databases and other important files have been encrypted. Your documents, photos, databases and other important files have been encrypted.
This is terrifying. Imagine the reaction that someone has when they're sitting there at their machine and this disembodied voice suddenly starts talking to them, telling them that their important files have been encrypted. And it's not just a scammy ad either. It's right. The important files have been encrypted. They do now face the real risk of never getting those files back again, at least not without paying the ransom. Now, I've mentioned social engineering a few times already throughout this course. Think about how this is perceived. So think about how this makes people feel. They're going to feel fearful, and particularly for less tech-savvy people, this is really going to frighten them. And that's the intention. Criminals want to create this sense of fear. And along with this sense of fear, they want to create the sense of urgency and then make it as easy as possible to pay. It's just good business sense. And unfortunately, that's what it boils down to. They're trying to get those conversion rates up as high as possible. And using scary computer-generated voices is just one way of doing that. But it's not just audio which is intended to frighten. Have a look at this one. This is the Jigsaw ransomware. And the image that you're looking at here is Billy the Puppet from the horror movie Saw. Now, right off the bat, that in itself makes the point about trying to frighten people. They've actually picked imagery from a horror movie. They've called this variant of ransomware Jigsaw because that was the alias used by John Kramer in the movie Saw. He was the guy who was capturing people and trapping them in these puzzles that they had to escape from. Just as in the movie there were these time-bound puzzles that created a sense of urgency for the victims that Jigsaw had captured, in the ransomware there's also time pressure, because as you can see here in the description, it starts deleting files. Every hour it deletes files, increasing in amount every time. It gives you a total of 72 hours, and then it deletes them all. As time progresses, a countdown appears. And in this particular case, there's 1 hour to go and there'll be one file deleted. So you're going to lose a personal file that you may never be able to get back again. The messaging here also encourages the victim not to try anything funny. And it goes on to say the computer has several safety measures to delete your files. One of those safety measures is that if the machine is forcibly rebooted, it'll delete 1,000 of them. Now, there are many things here that aren't particularly new in the way ransomware works, but the way this one goes about it in terms of the imagery and the way it creates that sense of urgency and time pressure are again very carefully orchestrated social engineering techniques. Now, as it turns out, Jigsaw turned out to be not quite as puzzling as what they would like you to believe, and I'm going to come back to that a little bit later on. But in terms of talking about how ransomware is evolving, I want to show you something a bit different. This is the Dog Spectus ransomware variant, and what you're actually looking at is an infected Android device discovered in April 2016. Like some of the other examples we saw earlier on, this was delivered via a hostile ad network, except we're talking now about a mobile device. This particular variant of ransomware actually leveraged an exploit that was discovered in the hacking team breach in the middle of 2015. So this was the Italian security firm that created various exploits often sold to governments who were compromised and had huge amounts of their software and personal documents leaked online. So this exploit came from there, and it specifically targeted Android devices running on Jelly Bean. So now we're talking about dating back to the 2012 era. So that's a 4-year-old operating system at the time this ransomware hit. Mobile is a new frontier, particularly mobile devices such as Android, which operate in a way that allows arbitrary software to run. But another first that we've seen around the same time, so around the first half of 2016, is Macs being infected with the key ranger variant of ransomware, which was distributed via a rogue version of the transmission torrent client. Traditionally, we primarily think of PCs being the ones that are at risk of malicious software, but Key Ranger just goes to show that if it has an operating system, it is potentially at risk. This is the way ransomware is evolving, targeting new platforms. There's one other quite alarming example of the way ransomware is evolving that I want to show you, and it's this one. This is Ransom 32, except you're not looking at ransomware running on an infected machine. Instead, you're looking at a web application that allows you to build your own ransomware. Ransom 32 is actually very unique in two different ways. So firstly, it's actually written in JavaScript. Just about anything can be written in JavaScript these days, and this is a case of where it's actually being used to create malicious software. So now we're talking about using modern web technologies to create malicious software that's going to encrypt files on the victim's machine. So that's one, it's JavaScript. Two is that this is ransomware as a service. And what I mean by that is that this website is stood up so that anybody can come along to it, plug in their Bitcoin address, tweak the settings here, which we'll go through in a moment, and then produce their own variant of ransomware which they can distribute out to their victims. The person using this service then receives payment, minus a small service charge, on behalf of the Ransom 32 creators, and in so many ways, it's analogous to the software as a service sorts of models that we have in modern day cloud environments. Now, this isn't the first case of doing ransomware as a service. We saw examples such as Tox in 2015, but particularly combined with that JavaScript choice, it makes it quite a unique implementation. When you think about it, ransomware as a service actually makes a lot of sense, at least from the criminal's perspective. And it makes sense for all the same reasons that other things as a service, namely infrastructure, platforms, and software as a service, all make sense to us. So for example, it's a really low effort to ramp up. If you want to get into the ransomware game, this is a very low friction way of doing it. You also don't need a lot of skill. You literally just go to this screen and configure the options. So for example, here's the split that you'll get. The attacker takes 75% in this case. You have a dashboard. You can track how your ransomware is performing on your victims' machines. You get a whole bunch of other behavioral characteristics that you can configure such that you have your own unique variant of the Ransom 32 ransomware, which you can then download and distribute. This is a really easy service to reuse. And for the creators of the Ransom 32 service, it makes sense to them. They just had to create the service and then wait for other criminals to come by and configure their own variants of the ransomware. One of the other things that Ransom 32 does is it has a proof of life feature. So it has the ability to actually decrypt one file in order to demonstrate to the victim that it does indeed have the capability to reverse the encryption. And all they need to do is pay enough money, the amount of which is also configurable here, and they'll get their files back. So that's a few different examples of the way ransomware is evolving. And we've seen different dimensions. Using audio, creating fear, almost gamifying it using puzzles, targeting other platforms, and even turning it into a service. And the alarming bit is that most of what we've just seen has evolved in only the last 12 months before the time of recording. Ransomware is moving very quickly. Let's go and talk about how to defend against it. By now, you're probably pretty endorsed in just how vicious ransomware can be. And clearly, this is not something that we want in any of our environments, whether they be corporate environments or personal environments. It's nasty stuff and we want to keep it out. Let's talk about some different ways we can do that. First of all, in early 2016, US CERT issued this advisory. In fact, this was a rare joint cyber alert in conjunction with Canada, and it's warning about the surge in ransomware attacks. Only a week before this, the FBI issued a private alert to US businesses seeking their help with investigation of the attacks. I'm showing you this firstly to reiterate just how big of an issue ransomware has become. And secondly, because this advisory does have a bunch of pretty good advice in it as well. So let's start talking defense. And I want to start with this. This, as the title of the window suggests, is the Jigsaw decryptor. This will actually decrypt machines that have been encrypted with the Jigsaw variant of ransomware. This was created by the security researchers mentioned here on the screen, and it's available for free. This is great. This is just what we want to see. And as much as I want to show you this as a ray of hope, it's also exceptional. Jigsaw was poorly constructed ransomware. And as scary as the imagery and the countdowns and the deleting files actually are, it's also exceptional in that it is decryptable. Variants such as Locky have proven enormously resilient. And when they get encryption right, it does just what encryption is designed to do. It locks those files away until there's a private key. So as much as we'd love to see a version of this for every variant of ransomware, it's simply not the case. We need better defensive measures, and that's what I want to talk about now. Let's go and start here. Backups are one of the most fundamental ways of recovering from a ransomware attack. If all the files are encrypted and you can simply go and grab a backup from before the ransomware hit, then you just restore the files and everything's okay. Certainly, we'd like to think so, but unfortunately, it's also not always that simple. For one, what if you've backed up encrypted files? So what if your backups are being overwritten by files which have since been changed by the malicious software? So of course, the defense for that is that we need versioned backups. And now this comes down to a question of backup rotation strategy. How many versions do you have? And are you actually able to retrieve the one that was pre-ransomware? This also speaks to the point about recovery. And very often we talk about backup being useless unless you have a good recovery strategy as well. So just as when you're planning for disaster recovery under more natural circumstances, planning for disaster recovery in the event of ransomware also requires some very careful testing of that recovery process. What's important though is not to think of this as an easy fix, because it most likely isn't. So have a think about the way ransomware works encrypting files. It's not going to simply just encrypt everything in an instant. And indeed there are ransomware variants that try to slow the rate of encryption. So now you might have a situation where you've had files that have been encrypted over a period of days, even weeks, and then both good and bad versions of the files spread over many different backup snapshots. You're going to pay for that recovery process in terms of effort. It's still an expensive exercise. And you can burn through a lot of people time in particular trying to go and find all the good versions of files. Think about that back in the context of the Hollywood Presbyterian. How long would it take them to burn through that $17,000 of people time if they had a situation where they had both good and bad versions of files spread over many different backup snapshots? 17 grand doesn't go far then. So even with backups, the ROI of actually paying the ransom may have actually made sense. Now, within an organisation, backups and indeed disaster recovery processes generally tend to be a bit more formalised than at home. So also consider at the personal level. What's your own backup strategy? So for example, I have a NAS drive. It constantly backs up to cloud storage and periodically to an external storage device, which I then rotate off-site with another one stored in a secure location. As much as you don't want your place of work losing critical business documents, you also don't want to be losing the family photos. Backup and recovery processes are important, but in terms of ransomware, They're a cure once you already have the disease. Let's go and talk about prevention as well. This chart is from the Verizon 2016 Data Breach Investigations Report. And what we're looking at here is the age of Flash versions that were found on machines that were infected with ransomware where Flash was the attack vector, or at least vulnerabilities in Flash were the attack vector. What this is actually telling us is that over half the machines that were infected in this sample size had versions of Flash that were more than a year old. Patch your things. This happens because plugins remain unpatched. I spoke earlier on about how plugins like Flash and Silverlight and Java are often the attack vector, particularly for drive-by attacks by malicious websites or infected ad networks. And what this is actually showing us here is that attackers can get a lot of mileage out of even very well-known and long since patched versions of plugins. Now, it's not just plugins, of course. We need to keep operating systems and applications and other software products in the environment fully patched. And that's the overarching theme here. Vulnerabilities in software products are often the vector by which ransomware enters the machine. A diligent patch regimen is absolutely essential. Let's go and look at another defense. The principle of least privilege is really a fundamental security concept, and it's actually pretty simple as well. Don't give anything access to anything that it doesn't need in order to fulfill its legitimate purpose. Now, this principle applies to multiple things that you have within your environment, and one of those things is people, particularly when we think back to that diagram of how Locky works, and it also traverses the network and encrypts files on other machines. Have a really good think about who actually needs access to what. If someone can access a file on a shared drive, and a ransomware variant such as Locky is executing on their machine under their identity, then that file is at risk. Now, it doesn't matter whether we're talking about an entry-level intern or the CEO of a company, the same rule applies. What does this individual actually need in order to fulfill their job? And if they don't need it, make sure they don't have access to it. This is a great way of limiting the damage that malicious software can do. Another resource we can apply this principle to is software. So in particular, having an application whitelist within the organization. So what software is actually allowed to run on machines? What's approved? If you can whitelist that, particularly at the group policy level, so that untrusted software simply can't be installed, that's going to greatly reduce the risk. Another place we can apply that principle is to the network. So have a think about what machines should be able to access what resources. Can networks be further logically segmented in order to minimize and contain risks? We've traditionally seen that between network segments such as the internal network and the DMZ, but increasingly we see that within internal networks as well. And just like with the people and software point here as well, the principle of least privilege is all about reducing and containing risk. Let's go and look at something a little bit different. And this is one of the riskiest things that you have in your network. Humans are notoriously exploitable. We are the soft center of even the most well-secured networks. And I've touched on the role that social engineering plays so many times already throughout this course. It's still a big issue. That's still one of the best bang for your bucks that criminals can get, engineering the humans. We see attempts to do that every single time we get a phishing email. And in recent times, we've particularly seen this with this class of phishing attack, which is being referred to as whale phishing, sometimes referred to as the CEO scam. So this is where attackers are specifically impersonating an authority figure, because from a social engineering perspective, people are more likely to be compliant when they believe that it's someone in a senior position that's contacted them. If they receive an email with an attachment and they genuinely believe it's from the CEO, the chances of them opening that email are going to be a lot higher than if it's just random spam. So clearly, the trick with humans is training. And not just the one-off annual exercise where they'll watch a short video, answer some questions, and then go on and forget about it. But training programs that become ingrained in the way they work, We've seen some really innovative programs come out in recent times that continue to test employees' susceptibility to attacks such as phishing. So certainly humans are one of the big risks, and training them appropriately is essential. Let's go back to technology controls though, because inevitably, one of the most fundamental defenses for malware in general is antivirus. But there's a problem. Let's take a look at what that is. For many years, antivirus has depended on the basic premise of knowing what to look for. A virus strain is released, antivirus vendors analyze it, create a signature, push that signature out to the clients running the AV product, and then if they see software or behavior that matches that signature, then it's a hit and they can quarantine it or take other appropriate actions. The problem is though, the antivirus needs to know what to look for. And as you can see from the comment here, it doesn't take much to actually change the signature of a ransomware product and render it undetectable to traditional antivirus products. Traditional AV usually also runs on the endpoint. It's sitting there running on the machine. It's looking for potentially malicious behavior on that specific machine, matching those specific signatures. So it's a very constrained set of parameters that it's working with. As soon as those parameters change, we have a gap, and it may be as a result of just a minor modification. So the problem with all of this is that traditional antivirus and signatures is always just behind the wave. It's waiting for someone to get compromised, and that someone could be many thousands of someones as well, because traditional AV needs that to happen first before the signatures can be created. The future of antivirus is moving more towards identifying behavioral characteristics instead. We'll often see this term, User Behavioral Analytics, or UBA for short. And a really simple example of how this might work is that an unknown ransomware variant, which wouldn't be detected based on traditional signatures, changes 1,000 files in one go. Behavioral analytics would suggest that this is not the way a normal user behaves. This is abnormal behavior. We should identify this, because if we can identify it, it doesn't matter if we have a situation like on the screen here where there's a minor modification to an AV product. If it causes this abnormal behavior, it doesn't matter what the source software is, because we're not looking at that. We're looking at the behavior. Let's take a closer look at how behavioral analytics work. Much of what we're talking about with UBA is understanding what normal looks like. So there's a baselining process where we say what is the typical behavior of a user. Now, of course, we need to be conscious that different users, particularly different roles within an organization, have different behavioral norms. So the baselining process gets tailored to the behavioral norms of the target. When that's done, now we can start to talk about what is abnormal. Because if it's not normal, we're going to flag that as suspicious. So for example, if we're seeing reconnaissance on the network, and this is important too because this is not just an endpoint solution anymore. Good UBA products are now smart enough to say what is happening on our broader network as a whole. So for example, are we seeing someone running Nmap and scanning every port on every device in a subnet? That's going to be one of the very first malicious behaviors we see, not just from ransomware, although of course the likes of Locky are looking for other network devices, but also from other malicious actors in the network. Another example of what user behavioral analytics may look for is privilege escalation. Have important security groups or group policies suddenly been modified? That's really important. That's an early indicator of compromise. Mass file deletions is another one. We saw Jigsaw earlier on, which would actually delete files from an infected machine. Would that be abnormal behavior? Not just deletions either, but think about the very nature of the way ransomware that encrypts files works. Now we're talking about mass changes of files, particularly with an endpoint solution running on a local machine, and we're seeing changes on a remote device. That's the sort of thing that can often be tricky to pick up, and that's where something like UBA makes a lot more sense. Same again with data exfiltration. Are there suddenly large unexpected volumes of data leaving the network? And for all of these classes of behavior, and many others that I haven't listed here, What we want to see is IT getting early alerts. So how fast can we let someone know that there's a problem? The important thing with all of this is that UBA is looking for the signs of ransomware, not for the ransomware itself. That's what traditional signature-based detection is for. So particularly if you are in a corporate environment and you have all of these complex interactions between PCs and servers, have a really good think about how much malicious activity you could actually detect. Ransomware is evolving really quickly. We're seeing just a snapshot of what we know today scrolling past the screen now. Defending against these attacks requires a multifaceted approach. Having good backups so that you can recover, patching your things, training your people, and being really conscious of where you have protection from the likes of signature-based antivirus and where you have gaps, particularly gaps that are now being addressed by this emerging class of user behavioral analytics products. That's where ransomware defense is at now, and it goes well beyond what traditional endpoint protection ever could. Let me summarize some of the key things we covered throughout this course. I did talk about a lot, but I want to draw out a few in particular. And the first thing that should be really evident now is just how effective ransomware is. It works so well that even the FBI are telling people to pay the ransom. Well-constructed ransomware is enormously effective. We're seeing it delivered via multiple channels as well. We saw infected websites and ad networks, and of course email delivery, where we see so many different classes of malicious software delivered. I also talked about the evolution of ransomware and touched on a number of different things, including how some of these traditionally safe platforms, or certainly platforms we perceived as safe, such as OS X, are now becoming targets. We just looked at defenses, and one of the most fundamental defenses was a backup strategy that was carefully rotated. Although, as I said then, even with good backups and the ability to restore them, it's often going to be an expensive process, if not directly in dollars, then in time. And what we really want is prevention. So this is why we want to see things like a robust patching regimen, and this principle of least privilege applied to people, software, and networks. How can we try and minimize the damage if something gets in? I just touched on signatures, the traditional way that antivirus defended against malicious software. And the risk, of course, is that signatures are something that's always prepared in reaction to having seen malicious software, so after people have been infected. And that took us all the way through to talking about UBA, User Behavioral Analytics. And this is where we're talking about getting out in front of the attacks, looking for the behavior of malicious software, instead of waiting until we see it and then watching out for it again. And that's a really fundamentally different security philosophy. They're the key things I hope you've been able to take away from this course. I do hope it's been useful to you and it helps you avoid experiencing this particularly malicious class of software firsthand. Thank you very much for watching. I'm Troy Hunt.